We are live. This is Literary Roadhouse. One short story once a week. I'm Maya.
I'm Rami.
And I'm Anais.
And today we are discussing Defender of the Faith by Philip Roth. I chose this story because after his recent death last May, I realized I'd never read any of his work. Defender of the Faith was published in 1959 and is the first published story by Philip Roth. In this story, we follow a sergeant freshly returned from the European front after World War II. He is assigned to a training facility, and on his first day, a young soldier, Sheldon Grossbart, confronts him in an attempt to verify that he is Jewish and immediately runs back to tell the other two Jewish men in the unit. This encounter sets the tone for the rest of the story as Shelton coerces, lies, and tries to get privileges from the sergeant. The privileges are anything from an announcement they can attend Friday services when the unit is cleaning to passes when the CO is away. The sergeant struggles with his duties as sergeant, his post-war emotional distance, and cultural familiarity with the three Jewish soldiers in his unit. This escalates until finally Shelton pushes too far with his lies, and the sergeant lashes out in revenge, ensuring that Sheldon will be on the Pacific Front with the rest of the unit.
Okay. Perfect.
You seem surprised that was so succinct. I actually wrote it in advance. I pulled an Anais.
I could tell you were reading it, and that's what surprised me.
Well, it's funny because this is what happens when you cut out social media. All of a sudden, you get productive. Low key, I'm going to turn into you in another couple months. It's going to be scary. So, let's just start top level. Because like I said, I've never read Philip Roth before. And we're missing Gerald, which is kind of a bummer because I'm assuming he probably has. How did you guys feel about this story, just initially?
Really liked it.
Yeah, I liked it a lot. I found myself thinking about it more than I thought I would after I finished reading it, so that's a good sign.
Yeah, I had a similar feeling. One of the odd things that my first initial thought was, I started reading it, I copied and pasted it over to a separate document, so I wasn't looking at the New Yorker as I was reading it. And so I didn't see what the date was. And I don't know Philip Roth. I just know he died. I didn't know how old he was. I didn't have a frame of reference for when this could have been written. And as I was reading it, I was like, oh, this is too modern to be World War II. And I kind of thought maybe it was a writer error. That maybe it was a newer story portraying World War II and accidentally too modern. And then I saw the date and I was like, wow, his writing is so timeless. It sounds like it could have been written last week.
Until you just said the date in your intro, I didn't realize it either.
Yeah, it sounds so modern. I was really, really surprised by my initial reaction. It said more about me and my biases than anything else. But at top level, I think I like this story.
So you've said this before on shows when you say something's modern. Do you mean because of the themes that it's exploring, the way it's exploring it, or because of the language?
The language, the way it reads. A lot of times when you read something from the 50s, there's a certain feel, a certain rhythm, almost a flavor of the writing. People generationally, we tend to use vocabulary slightly differently. Words change over time. And a lot of times I can't put my finger on it, but a lot of times language, when you read something, you can almost date it if you've read enough. And every once in a while I run into a story that was written, a while ago that sounds like it was written now. It doesn't happen all the time, but this was definitely one of those moments because it was so modern that I thought originally, I was like, oh, this couldn't be World War II. He messed up his characterization. This is too modern. And I was like, what? 1959? Really? And that goes to my own biases of what I think World War II should sound like. Probably because I've watched a bunch of movies, World War II movies, listening to how GIs talk. This doesn't read like that. This reads much more natural.
Yeah, I guess maybe because I've read Vonnegut and their contemporaries and everything, it didn't feel super, super modern to me. It felt like of that time. But especially because the tone wasn't as brooding as I feel like today's tones are. But one of the things that I did notice as I was reading it was this weird way in which I felt like I didn't want to stop reading. I wanted to keep reading and know what happens next. But I wasn't super jazzed or excited either. It was this weird state of I'm reading this and I want to read it, but I'm not super excited. It's hard to explain. There was this just a slow weird commitment to the story. Like, just like, I want to know. It was strange. It was very strange. It was a strange feeling.
I think I understand what you're saying. For me, as I was reading it, I would say I wanted to see what was going to happen next. But was I excited I'm so emotionally invested in the story, I can't put it down? Exactly. No. What I found myself do, I related to it. I found it funny. I found a lot of parts of the story very funny. And I would say I related to it like a comedy. You know, this was very much not Saving Private Ryan. This was more, you know, a comedic version. I'm trying to remember, what's a comedic war movie? You know, like there are parts of like Full Metal Jacket that are pretty comedic. So like I kind of related to this as like a comedy about war rather than like a deep, intense drama about war.
I don't know. I didn't see.
Although I think that is probably a fairly modern way to look at it. I wonder if people, when they read it, found it that funny. I don't think so.
Did you, Rami?
I'm just trying to think. I mean, I guess some of the interactions were kind of entertaining, amusing.
I think where Rami's at, where there were moments that were funny. There were some things, especially that the captain said, that were just like the casual, like, assumptions and stereotypes that would come through, just and moments among the three Jewish privates that were pretty funny. But I wouldn't say it was a comedy so much. I engaged with it in this strange sort of like, I don't know. I just thought it was smart without being emotional, but not too smart. It wasn't. It occupied a very strange space that I enjoyed, and made me think about it more than I felt, even days after. Yeah,
that's interesting. So, how did you guys feel about the interactions between the sergeant and Sheldon?
I was constantly just like, he's playing you. Oh my God, you're getting played. But I think that was well written. I'm supposed to be feeling that way. It's written in such a way where even though I'm close to the sergeant's point of view, and even though the sergeant is like, you know, resisting but falling for it, resisting and falling for it the whole time, I'm like, stop falling for it. He's playing you. And that's really skillful to do. I'm in one point of view, but I'm not getting tricked in the same way that the point of view character is being tricked. That's really smart, which I liked. And I found Sheldon really manipulative to the point that I almost started rooting for him a little bit. I was just like, you know what, guy, you earned it. You like because the harms were so minimal. Like, he wasn't doing real harm to other people. There was a part of me that was like, you're just so slick. Like, go to Monmouth. You know, like at the end, I was like, well, you did it, you know? Yeah. I just, I felt like he was playing to the sergeant's Jewishness in a way that was very smart, where he was just making him feel guilty. And I think that happens a lot in minority communities, not just the Jewish one. And it was, I recognized that, and I liked the way that it played out.
It felt very familiar in that way. Yeah, I mean?
Did you recognize that he was getting played from the outset? Because initially I didn't.
I think after the church scene. I think once he goes to the church and he sees what's actually... I kind of sensed it initially. I was like, I really don't think the Sheldon guy is that religious. There was just a sense. And then once the church scene happened, I'm like, yeah, no, this guy's just... He's milking it.
Yeah, I'm with Anais. Like, I snickered at the very first meeting. I was like, really? This kid's annoying. And I very rarely feel my age. Like, I tend to forget how old I am. And this story actually made me, like, remember how old I was, because this interaction is an interaction I see a lot between older people and younger people. Like that annoying little kid, or like when you have two dogs and you get a new puppy and the puppy's like running around the dog's feet and the big dog is just like annoyed. Like I had that feeling. And I think maybe that's part of what made it feel like it could be so modern, because this very well could have been like a baby boomer and a millennial, like a commentary on their struggles and their annoyances with each other, very much. And that conflict between generations is constant, and it goes back, you know, every generation has that. But I think these two are actually closer together in age. The maturity of the sergeant comes from the fact he spent so much time on the actual war front. And his vulnerability, I don't think it's because he's falling for it. I think it's because he's yearning for a familiarity. He's yearning for that. And he knows he's being played, but he's tired and he just doesn't have the energy in him to fight it anymore. And that's just kind of the sense I got, was just a guy that's just tired, and this young kid is just annoying the living daylights out of him. And he's going to give him a bone every once in a while because, he's a young kid and he's kind of adorable, but oh my God.
And I think also on some level, Sheldon's very shrewd, and he picked on quickly exactly how to manipulate this guy. So this guy had sort of calcified his emotions against anything, whether it was the triumph over Germany or the loss of his friends. He wasn't feeling anything. And this guy just sort of found a way to make him feel just a little bit and soften him up by playing to those roots. By remember when he was like, I could see how he got to Shulman. Oh, you're from New York? What borough? He's like,
yeah, totally.
Once he had gone through it, he saw what the guy was doing. And again, I don't even think the teenage kid knows what he's doing. Like, I don't think he's sitting there scheming. It's just natural to him. He's just like this slick, like little, low harm con artist.
So in other words, he's a New Yorker.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. So it was just, he just had a hustle to him. And, I just felt like the guy got played because the guy picked up on his weaknesses. Sheldon saw that this is a man who's emotionally stunted by choice because of war. And just a little bit of like chumminess and he just breaking through, it worked. It was super effective. I mean, Sheldon's brazen as hell. He goes out, he lies about the setter, he has Chinese food. He should have come back and be like, oh, sorry, there was no gefilte fish left. But instead, he says, here's an egg roll. Like, why are you rubbing it in his face? Like, whew, ballsy.
Yeah, he's a very ballsy, annoying kid. How about you, Ravi? How did you feel about it?
Yeah, I can relate to the comments you made about, differences in generations, or younger and older, and just someone who's trying to pull a fast one or be slick,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I can't picture Ravi ever trying to pull a fast one, but I know it's in him. Otherwise, he couldn't work for the CIA.
We can't talk about this when we're live.
One of the things that I found interesting reading this story is when this came out, there was a lot of controversy about this story. It was Philip Roth's first story. It was really close to the war. I think the war had only been like 13 years over. And here was a Jewish American author writing. Some of his characters have negative stereotypes. Sheldon, like, very much is a negative stereotype of the time, of Jewish people. And so a lot of the Jewish community called him a self-hating Jew. They tried to ban him. They, talked about him from the pulpits. The rabbis were not stoked about him. Now, all these decades later, he's very much embraced by the community. And one of the things I was reading about that, and it struck me how in Black literature, we have no problem showing the negative sides of Black culture and the positive sides of Black culture, from Invisible Man. Like, the opening of Invisible Man is rough, dude, and it's not a reflection on the society as a whole. We have one character who's bad, and we don't think, oh my goodness, they're making all of us look bad because of this one character. What do you think it is that created such controversy? Do you think it was because of the war or other things?
I don't know. It surprises me that the big controversy came from the Jewish community. I didn't do that research. I would have thought the controversy would have come from the army, because the way that the captain reacts to things, they're a little like stiff, the way that they don't really seem to care about the Jewish community. But maybe in the 50s, it wasn't as big of a deal to portray that. But like, if it's from the Jewish community, I'm not really sure, because there was other Jewish characters that were like the typical like good kid, and you know, that was really religious. Like there was other characters there. Maybe was it Sheldon? Was it because Sheldon was a hustler that they rejected the characterization, or was it the way that
I don't know.
was it the way that he used Jewishness to manipulate? Because he also would call the sergeant that he's a self-hating Jew, that you're just like them, that you're like a goy and everything else. Like maybe it's the Jewish on Jewish manipulation that's the problem.
I don't know. I mean, from what I was reading, a lot of Philip Roth's work when it came out in the 50s was considered very problematic in the Jewish community, and he was considered to be a very negative influence on Jewish children. He didn't want anybody reading his work. Rabbis thought that it was just, you know, the Jewish equivalent of blasphemous. And as I was reading it, I had the same thought. Like, now we talk about diversity in fiction, and if you're going to have a character from a specific background that's commonly portrayed as negative, if that character in your story is negative, the way to offset that is to also show positive people from that particular demographic. And I felt like Philip Roth was very pointed to have 3 Jewish characters in the story, and they're 4, and they're very different. They're very different from one another. They're not all stereotypes. As far as what the community could have found objectionable, you know, I'm thinking back on old Jewish stereotypes, and one of them would have been, you know, the well-oiled hustler who's using connections to get through the ranks and get what he wants. Like, those would have been very typical feelings about the Jewish community. And so here is Philip Roth having a character that embodies that. But at the same time, there's so many other characters. I don't get it.
You know, I looked it up real quick because I'm curious, and there's a whole article, which is, the headline is "Why Philip Roth Pissed Off So Many Jewish Readers." Great. And maybe this story isn't capturing 100% what the criticisms were, but here's the criticisms, which is that his stories constantly depicts Jewish characters as depraved and lecherous, and that he persistently implied a lack of redeeming values among Jews that was akin to the thinking that led to the Holocaust. So maybe there's 2 things going on here. Maybe it's the closeness to the Holocaust that's the problem, because any sort of bad characteristic about Jewish people, it's like you're just like Hitler, like a hypersensitivity to that maybe we don't have as much now, where we can talk in a more nuanced way. Like maybe that's part of it. And I think this doesn't have a depraved and lecherous creature. Unless in the 50s, somebody who was a hustler as much as Sheldon was seen as like just abhorrent. But like, I feel like in the 2018,
I think Sheldon would have been felt that way, because before his collection came out, there was already upset just from this story. This story came out, it was the only story out, and people were pissed off. And then his collection came out and it got worse. And what I would say is that I think there's a lot of nuance in this story. And I think at the time, possibly because of the proximity to the Holocaust and how much had been gone through, there wasn't an openness to look at both the positive and the negative sides of the culture. You see that sometimes when like a Black movie maker will have a film with a negatively portrayed Black character, certain parts of like the church community will be upset, and they're like, well, we're already portrayed really badly in media, so why you got to add to it? And I'm wondering if that's what it is. But at the same time, the ability to look at all the parts of your culture and to create fiction from that and to be introspective about your culture, that is what novelists do. Like that's like the whole like point, dude. Like it's not to make everybody feel good all the time, unless you want to be a fairy tale writer.
Yeah. And also this story, touching a little bit on what you said, but pulling it away from like one character into the whole culture. So this story actually does do something, which was another criticism, which was that a significant theme of his was rejection of Jewish life, not because it is too Jewish, but because it is not Jewish enough, because it is so dominated and infused by the American ethos that it partakes of some of the same corruption, offering no significant alternative. And you can definitely see in the story how the tone here is very much them wanting all these special accommodations for being Jewish is ridiculous. Like, even as the sergeant is making concessions, you as the reader pick up on a mood here, which is supposed to be like, guys, come on. Like that's the way he's sort of driving you. And that can be criticism of this story in particular.
I found it interesting that he chose to have young men who were not observant.
Except one.
Trying
one
to get
was.
accommodations for their faith, minus the one guy who was observant. And the guy who was observant didn't say anything.
Yeah.
He wasn't the one asking. He wasn't, but more than being used, he's observant. He's not asking for special treatment. He's not complaining about the food. He's puking in private. He doesn't want to make a stink. He's very observant, and he recognizes that his purpose in the army is for a higher purpose. Whereas the other guys that aren't observant are the ones who are asking for more accommodations, but they're not actually using them. So I found that interesting and very pointed. So the best example of this would be towards the end of the story when the sergeant gets backed into a wall and gives passes so that they can go to Passover at Sheldon's aunt's house. But then they don't go there. They go get Chinese food.
Yeah, and the religious observer one, even though he's a religious observer and everything, he's sort of in on the lie. So, he's being used.
Is he really,
but he's
though?
passive.
Like,
I don't know.
I see him. I feel like when they were asking for the pass, he probably thought they were going to go to the ants.
Yeah.
And I can see him complaining when they show up at Chinese food and saying, we should be back at base. Isn't it right? Like, he struck me as that type of person. So I feel like the criticisms don't necessarily hold, because in the story, who is the best character? Who is the morally upright character? I wouldn't say it's the sergeant, because the sergeant, like, his revenge is pretty brutal. I would say it's the young observant one. I felt for him, but is he morally good in the story?
Yeah. There was no moral upstanding one to me, because even the passive one who's being used, he's still complicit in staying silent about everything. Like, even if he was surprised that there was no setter when he came back, he could have done something, but he didn't. Fishbane does nothing. There's no morally upright character in the story.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's you don't want to be accused of, snitching or, I don't know.
No, but you could still do something like, I honestly didn't know this was wrong. How can I make it up to you? Like, I don't want to be a part of this. Like, you can still find some way. Like, you're not snitching. The guy already knows he got an egg roll. Like, I just feel like there's no one who really was a moral upstanding character. Even the sergeant, you touched on how at the end, it's funny. So to me, I also thought it was harsh. I'm like, that is way harsh. Like, you're sending someone to almost certain death. Not almost, but like a private on the front lines. Come on. But I read real quick some other analysis, like just getting another perspective. And apparently there's 3 ways to read the ending, which was interesting to me. I don't know if you guys read that.
I'm very curious about this, because as I was reading the ending, there was so much foreshadowing. I totally thought that he was going to replace him with the observant, quiet one. I thought the observant, quiet one would go home and everybody else in the unit would go. But the fact that he didn't choose, the fact it was just whatever, just choose one, alphabetical if you have to, took his hands off of it. I found that whole thing interesting. But I'm curious about alternate ways of reading the ending, because I can't figure out how you would read it any different.
I'm not convinced by them, but 1, it's vindictive. 2, it's equalizing and making things more fair, not letting the hustler get his way and having someone get random luck, which I'm not super convinced of, but okay. And the 3rd one is because the hustler is going to protect the other 2 Jewish ones on the front lines by hustling, but he was going to let them go to the Pacific Rim when he went to Monmouth, New Jersey. So that's the least convincing one. Like, well, now they'll all have a chance.
I don't buy it at all. Because, it's even said in the story, the sergeant says, he'll be good for them as long as it's to his advantage.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So if they're on the front and something happens and they've got to pick 2 Jewish guys, all of a sudden he's going to be Christian.
Yep.
By the way,
that's just Shelton's way.
I didn't see him sending the boys out to fight as certain death, because it's towards the end of the war And the start of the story, he says that it was he first got to the camp in May 1945. I know the war ended in 1945, but I just double checked real quick right now, and it has the ending of World War II as September 1945. So
no, yeah, because of the Pacific side of
But
it.
the Pacific
the
front
bombs
was
don't get dropped till August.
messy.
The Pacific side was bad.
Pacific
Iwo
front was not
Jima
fun.
is many movies. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of people forget that it wasn't just Germany.
Yeah, no, I
there
saw
was a whole lot of mess going on. I need to do more research on World War II because I've never like fully gotten a grasp of it. It was so big and so messy and crossed so many cultures. It was just very fascinating, and I definitely want to do more research on the Asian side of World War II because I don't fully understand what was happening over there.
Yeah, I just looked it up real quick. It was so the U.S. combat casualties in the war against Japan were 111,600 dead and 253,142 wounded. So it was still pretty heavy over there. And like they're looking at basically 41 to 45, which is from Pearl Harbor to when the bombs were dropped. Like, you know, considering that wasn't the main theater of the war. Yeah.
Yeah. And considering, you know, here's this kid that, you know, is used to getting his own way and is kind of soft. Like, he's a hustler, but he's kind of soft because he doesn't have to do any hard work because he's always pawning it off on somebody else. And now he's going to be at the front lines.
Yeah.
And he's terrified, rightfully so.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I see that as certain death. I don't think he'll survive that.
No.
All it takes is for him to piss off the right person.
Yeah. That's a little bit why there was a part of me that was like, at the end, the vindictiveness of getting him to go to the Pacific Theater really bothered me because it's like, yes, he's a hustler. Yes, all of this. But also at the end of the day, look, you got played. Live with that. Live and learn. Like, it's a little bit like, this is how it worked out. I'm a very like, don't meddle too much. Don't assume you know the right way. Don't make yourself an arbiter of things that you don't, you know what I mean? Like, it's a little bit like.
At the same time, he was the arbiter by giving this kid a little bit at a time. He gave this kid more huevos, essentially. Like, he had the balls to keep pushing for more and more and more because he kept being successful. And by him not going to the front line, somebody else was going to be going to the front lines in his place. And so I don't think as a morally upstanding person, you can let that stand. But at the same time, taking a stand against it is not great either morally. And I think that's why I appreciated the end where, you know, he's talking about how he can see the acceptance on his face and he's feeling just the acceptance of it as well. Like, he's taken the step. He knows that this may lead to the direct death of this kid, but he has accepted that.
You know, it's funny. So I don't even say I would super hard condemn the sergeant for this because of what you said. Like, there's a lot of, well, you just said he's sending someone else in his place, somebody else that could have gone to Monmouth who hadn't been scheming. But I think the line that really sort of made the ending perfect was the very last line. And then, resisting with all my will an impulse to turn and seek pardon for my vindictiveness, I accepted my own. I thought that was just a very good. It was just
talk
well done.
about perfect end lines. It's not very often with a short story that the last line is perfect. A lot of time it feels like they drop off or they're like tacked on. I think that is one of the most perfect ending lines for a short story I've ever read.
Yeah. Rami, were you going to say something earlier? You were like, by the way, and then.
Oh, it was that comment about them going to war near the end.
Yeah.
Such a good one. So how did you guys feel about the language? I already talked about it. Felt really modern to me. To me, what felt modern about it is that there wasn't a lot of flourishes. It seemed almost minimalistic in quality. It was what it was. But it was beautiful. Like, it was elegant is how I felt about the writing itself.
I appreciated that even though it was dealing with some moral ambiguity, some pretty heavy themes. There was a lot of places where the sergeant could have been self-reflecting. The mood could have been very heavy, very the MFA voice that I've complained about. This was ripe for that. And yet it didn't do that because it's from the 50s probably. Like, it's more just this is what happens, this is what happens, this is what happens with very little sort of tone and emotional manipulation. I appreciated that. It was a refresher. It was different.
Yeah, if this had been written nowadays, it would have been much more emotional.
Mm-hmm.
The good kid probably would have stayed home.
Or even if he did it, then there would be like this, like just the sergeant just would have been brooding all the time.
Racked with guilt,
Mm-hmm.
taking a long drive through Maine.
Yeah, it would have been raining in every scene.
We're so bad. Remy, any thoughts?
I like the writing too. Again, I always appreciate stories when they allow me to visualize and picture how everything is and immerse me into the story. So, yeah, that's good.
Remy, did the writing keep you focused throughout, or were there any places where you felt like you found yourself drifting off? I'm just curious.
No, not particularly. I mean, it was a long story, but I really enjoy things related, especially old war stories. Even though I wouldn't say this is necessarily a war story, but the setting of the military and that whole kind of milieu, it kept me engaged.
It's interesting you mentioned it being a long story because I plugged it into Word and I got like 10,000 words and I was like, no, that can't be right. I must have double pasted because it didn't feel that long. It was like the fastest 10,000 words I've ever read in my life.
Same.
Like, I'm still not entirely convinced that I didn't double post and double paste because I was like, there's no way that had to be 10,000 words. There's just no way.
Yeah, it went super fast for me, which I didn't expect. And also I did it it was a first thing in the morning read, which sometimes I'm more likely to drift because I'm still half asleep. But no, and then I read it again later and it's just fast.
I read it in a cafe with background noise.
Oh, wow.
I was focused the entire time, which never happens. If I'm reading in public, I have to put on like Chopin in my ears. And even then, sometimes I literally have to go find someplace quiet because my attention span is just messed. But it kept me focused the entire time. And I think it's because there wasn't any point where the language made me stop and have to decipher what I was seeing or decipher what I was thinking about. This is one of the stories where you read it and then you think about the interactions and, the underlying stuff afterwards. You're not dissecting it as you're reading it. There are some stories where you find yourself, what did they mean by that? As you're reading it, which slows you down. This didn't feel like that at all.
Yeah, I don't really have anything else though. I think it's a very focused story. It's about this thing, and that's what it's about.
Yeah. I don't have anything else either. It's very plain. It's very focused. I feel like it's a much better Hemingway. I need to read more Hemingway actually, so I can stop bashing him and make myself look like an idiot. I want to read some of his novels. I haven't really. There were a couple of his short stories I enjoyed when I read that Hemingway collection, but I'm still not entirely sold on his short stories. But I think I'm gonna like his novels. I want to read Movable Feast. I think I'm gonna like it. Like I've got it sitting there waiting for me.
Yeah. Well, this story, so we put in the Literary Roadhouse readers group, we put out a question like, who's an author we haven't read that you'd like us to read? And Richard Dennis, who we've mentioned before, longtime listener, possible future guest, he's also a writer. He mentioned Philip Roth. So I'm curious to see what he has to say. Like, Richard, here's questions for you to put in the comment in the Literary Roadhouse Readers Facebook group. Question number 1, is this typical of Roth? When you say read Roth, is it the kind of stuff you want us to read? Or is there another short story you think is more indicative? And 2, what did we miss about this story?
I think those are great questions because I really want to know, what did we miss? I feel like everything in the story was pretty much open to be read. I felt like there were layers, but there weren't so many layers. You felt like, you were excavating. And I just enjoyed the language and the simple, plain language. And I liked the interaction between the characters. I would say there isn't any particular character that I liked, but I liked the interaction of the characters, which isn't something I've gotten before. Like, the sergeant, he's okay. Sheldon, he's okay. But listening to those two, like, verbal, like, there was so many times when I was chuckling. And the humor that I found in the story wasn't particular like funny parts. It was the interaction between those two that I was constantly like chuckling and shaking my head in public, looking like a fool, because their interaction was just so, I recognized it. It felt real and it was humorous to me.
And he was able to, in dialogue, put in sarcasm, corrections, which is sometimes hard to put in dialogue because you're like, it's not clear you're correcting someone, and people like stopping in the middle of what they're saying to say something else, and I didn't get lost. So that's
I
very
loved
skillful.
how he was always saying like "sir," and then like Sheldon would just keep going, like he didn't even hear the correction. I was like such a kid. It's so cute. Okay, so are we ready to rate this puppy?
Yep.
I am. I want to give it a 6, but it's not a 6 to me. But it's not a 5.5 either. So I'm giving it a 5 3/4.
Oh my god!
I feel like a 5.5 is too low. I'm getting to 5 3/4. It's like almost perfect to me.
Okay. I'm torn between a 5 and a 5.5. 5.5. The more we talk about it, the more I'm like, yeah, there's a lot of stuff here because it stayed with me more than I expected. The reading experience was a 5, but everything after, I guess, 5.5. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'll go. I was also torn between 5.5 and 6, but 5.5 for me as well.
Okay.
Depending on how this goes, hopefully this will be a 1-question quiz.
Okay.
Because everyone knows, like, oh, it's Maya's quiz day. This is gonna suck. Okay. So during World War II, the Jewish population.
Are we gonna say the stories?
Oh yeah, tell me the stories.
Okay, I'm submitting. So in the Literary Roadhouse Readers Group, I'm going to keep plugging it because if you join, you can tell us what you read. Emily Craddock said that we need to read Ambrose Bierce. So I'm submitting A Current at Owl Creek by Ambrose Bierce.
And my submission is William and Mary by Roald Dahl.
Okay.
Oh, Anais, come on, you got this. I really don't like Roald Dahl. I keep trying.
I'm rooting for Anais
Maybe this will be the
also.
one. I don't know. Maybe this will be the one because I feel like Literary Roadhouse could be changed. The title of our podcast could be changed to "Let's Find Authors that Maya Hates and Make Her Like Them." So I feel like maybe Roald Dahl isn't a bad idea. So in the U.S. during World War II, there were approximately 4,770,000 Jewish people in the U.S. There was a large proportion of Jewish people in the army. How many people do you think served during World War II of Jewish American descent on, our military side?
Oh, God. I don't even know how big our military was in World War II.
We're going to go high or low. Whoever's closest. Yeah. 4 million, almost under 5 million people. How many people do you think signed up to fight World War II that were Jewish? Annie's, no Googling.
Yeah. I'm not Googling. I'm thinking. I'm doing numbers. I'm like, okay, of that 5 million, how many are probably of fighting age? And then how many are men? I'm trying to figure out yeah, I'm doing math in my head, but I'm probably not going to get there. At the time, it was probably younger, not older. I'm going to say about 1 million. Maybe just under. I don't know. The high hundreds of thousands.
Pick a number.
So what is your final answer? Hundreds of thousands, 1 million? Pick a number.
Okay. 800,000.
Okay. Rami?
Wow. 500,000?
Did you Google?
No.
You Googled.
No, I promise.
500,000?
It's 500. One source said 500,000, another source said 550,000. That was right on it. It's really fascinating because during the war, there was a lot of issues in the military with Jewish soldiers. There was a lot of anti-Semitism within the ranks. And so the Jewish soldiers dealt with a lot of crap on the front, but, they served in very large numbers for the proportion of the population. I think there were only 2 Medal of Honor winners, but there was so much happening. I read one story where there was a Jewish chaplain, a Catholic chaplain, and I think a Protestant chaplain, and a sub was going down, and they helped to evacuate all the soldiers. and they ran out of lifeboats, and the 3 chaplains gave up their lifeboat to save other soldiers.
Wow.
And they went down. And like, it was just fascinating, so fascinating reading about Jewish service in World War II on the American side, and just how much they dealt with, superiors giving them a hard time, hazing, abuse, rights not being recognized. It was really, really amazing reading some of this. So I would recommend anybody interested in learning more about Jewish service during.
Did I freeze?
No.
Chewies, you have to look it up on Google. There's a couple of them, and I can't wait to watch them because the reviews of them looked really good, and I'm looking forward to it. So you might want to do some research because the facts were interesting. I was like, oh, I can't make a quiz. There's just too much. I just couldn't do it. So what are we reading today, Rami?
For next week, we'll be reading a short story called William and Mary by Roald Dahl.
Okay. But before you go... Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, didn't they make that into an... I think I may like this story. If they did, I love that film.
Okay. Well, go read it and find out if it is. But before you go, listen, look. We're not trying to pull a fast one on you. We need to ask a favor. And it's not really us who wants this. It's our relatives who they really want to see that we're doing okay and have listeners who leave comments either at our website, literaryroadhouse.com, or on Twitter at Roadhouse, or in our Facebook group, the Literary Roadhouse Readers. Also, if you're a follower of the Literary Roadhouse Book Club, then you're probably dying to know which book will be our next destination. Will we look to the Pacific or to Monmouth, New Jersey for literary inspiration? Neither. We're going to Jamaica to read Here Comes the Sun by Nicole Dennis Benn. And also, we may be over 3 months late for Passover, but we're holding a setter anyway. Support our gefilte fish expenses and podcast growth at patreon.com/Literary Roadhouse. Every bit helps and gives exclusive access to author interviews. As always, share this podcast with the overprotective Jewish parents in your life. Shalom! And until next time, read a good story.